political candidates are more concerned to avoid alienating key constituents than strengthening support among those groups, right? So you can see how that factors, how risk aversion and risk seeking factors into that. I want to keep the ones that I already have, and I'm willing to risk everything on making them happy. That's a problem. That's what you should not do, right? You should because the losses are threefold, right? Because the losses, when you lose big. I'm trying to keep it simple. All right. Number 5. Framing is essential, right? Framing is essential in attaining public support, right? Framing is essential in attaining public support. I'm going to do 5, 6, and 7 all in one, and then I'll draw so I can make a very, very clear explanation of this. First point, framing is essential in attaining public support. Second point, frames above the status quo define the status quo as a loss, which we saw at the beginning, right? So now I'll start, right? Imagine that we have point here, whatever that point might be, right? This is my status quo. Frames above the status quo, and frames below the status quo are up for discussion, right? Okay. Framing is essential, and I'll explain what this means in a second. Frames above the status quo define the status quo with reference to the status quo as a loss. Frames below the status quo define the status quo as a gain. What sense does that make? Let's look at this situation. A situation where I look at the status quo as a loss. And then we'll look at the situation wherein I look at the status quo as a gain. So, first example. This is my example. The national education expenditure, right? The idea, the national education expenditure, is currently being framed as a loss. The status quo, right? If it is the case, I don't know if maybe I might not be assessing the situation right, but if we look at what's going on throughout the rest of the United States of America, especially middle America, Wisconsin and such, it seems to be the case that overwhelmingly, because we've globally, but definitely nationally experienced huge recession because of the 2008 crash, right? Well, because of that crash, governments tend more often than not, to cut from education, right? So there's going to be a cut in education to compensate for the budget. Well, as of now, the budget is, just for simple sake, I want to do like the simplest math possible, right? Let's just say the budget now is $100. So let's say the national educational budget is $100. It seems to be the case, however, that there's overwhelming consensus, right? There's overwhelming consensus, and I don't believe that there is, but let's just say that there's overwhelming consensus, or there's at least a moderate majority, 52, 51%, something like that. So consensus or majority, right? That $100 is too high. That everybody roughly agrees that it should be somewhere in the ballpark of, let's say, 50 bucks, roughly, right? So I'll put 50-ish, right? 50-ish. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. If it's currently the case that I frame the discourse as we ought to keep the budget where it is and cut somewhere else, which is what's being discussed by certain groups, right? So we ought to keep the national educational expenditure where it is, right? And they're looking at the status quo, everyone overwhelmingly saying it's 50-ish would be where it should be. Then we're looking at, person here is looking at the status quo as being a loss, right? You're attempting to tell me that I have to relinquish something that I already have. I already have it at $100. You're trying to take it away from me. Because you're trying to take it away from me, we recognize that we're going to be risk-seeking with respect to loss. There's more to risk and probably counterintuitively and probably wrongly, there's more to risk in attempting to preserve this $100 rather than reassessing my educational expenditure at around 50-ish, right? That's pretty, like, prospect theory and me right there. It's like, I get the theory, but I don't know where I stand on that, right? There's many more factors that go into that. You know, what happens to the other cuts? What are we going to do? Blah, 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 blah. But the idea is, individuals who view the status quo have framed above the status quo. I've framed above the status quo. So my point would be here. This point would be here. So frames above the status quo. This would be my reference dependency. My frames above the status quo will interpret the status quo as a loss. So I'm looking at it as a loss. The potential policies are going to be interpreted as a loss, and I'm probably going to be way more averse to losing, and I'm going to risk far more. I might even risk too much in attempting to preserve what I perceive to be a loss, right? So negotiators and negotiations, at this point, you can see how that's going to be problematic. Now, let's do a different example, right? So I would say contemporary educational expenditure discussion would be framed as being, within prospect theory, as being a loss, right? This is what we currently have. You're trying to take away from us. Therefore, there would be risk-seeking with respect to those losses. Next would be pre-Social Security is sort of my example. And I think this example works. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. No, actually, I do know it. I mean, theoretically, it has to work, right? Imagine a time before Social Security, right? Before Social Security was passed. Here is where... Now, there's a big assumption here, right? There's a global assumption, but I'm not going to get into the logics of it now. Imagine that I'm here, and someone is telling me, hey, you could get Social Security so that when you're old, we'll give you some money. And they're thinking to themselves, well, we don't get money now. I mean, I'm old, I meet the requirements, and I'm not getting money now, right? And you're telling me that you're going to give me this money. And the question is, well, what do I have to lose? And the government says, well, you know, there really isn't, per se for you, any risk at all. We're guaranteeing that when you reach this age, you will get this money, right? We're guaranteeing, this is option B, right? We're guaranteeing that when you reach this age, you will get this money. Overwhelmingly, everybody's going to choose that, right? Because you will be risk-averse with respect to gains, right? So we're risk-seeking with respect to losses, but we're risk-averse with respect to gains. There are no, I could factor in some risk, but I want to keep the example simple. If someone's telling me, I don't have anything now, I don't particularly need it maybe, right? Maybe I could do without it, but I don't have it now, and you're going to give me, you know, $900 a month or whatever it might be for X number of years, and I'm not getting that now, what do I have to lose, is the idea, right? So with respect to frames below the status quo in prospect theory, frames below the status quo in prospect theory are going to be construed as gains, right? The frame is below, but the conception of the status quo is going to be construed as a gain, which should be, hopefully, should be obvious now, and I'm hoping clear. Okay, so we see how that applies. What we've done is we've used prospect theory to talk about sort of candidate-constituency relationship. We've implemented, just briefly, right, prospect theory to talk about encroachment with respect to territorial defense and territorial acquisition. We've used prospect theory to talk about budget expenditure. Now, number 8, a decline in relative power is typically framed as a loss with a particular reference point in the past as the goal for power. Incremental increases in power are avoided for a return to the original reference point, right? So, again, on the Gissette model, right, because Gissette talks about this, and I think he does it best. If we're talking about power, so power is here, P-O-W. If we're talking about power and we're talking about time, then if we're here, and we say this is when we were a superpower and now we're no longer a superpower, then obviously what I'm going to do is I'm going to reflect back to a time when we had greater power than we have now as a nation, right? If we're talking about superpower, just more power status, and a gradual decrease in the amount of power, then what I'm going to do, and this is what it says, decline in relative power is typically framed as a loss, right? So I'm going to look at this state where I am now as a loss of power, right? I'm going to look at my current situation as a loss of power. Why? Because I'm reflecting back to a time when I had more power.